and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. From the Graphomania Podcast Network, I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I am Robbie Hurlocker. Today we are bringing to you part 2 of the Reynolds Pamphlet. Have you read this? Shh. Well, if you haven't, we're about to finish it off for you. In the last episode, we read for you the first, probably about a third of this document, where Alexander Hamilton is not at all happy with the people that are bringing accusations against him.
We thought we had read almost the first half, but it had been a while since we had actually recorded. We recorded that back in August, and we put that out thinking it was half, and then sat down to record this today and finish out our reading of the Reynolds Pamphlet and realized we had quite a bit more to go.
Man, Alexander Hamilton wrote a lot of words.
Yes, like he was running out of time almost.
Non-stop.
Someone should write a song about this.
Yeah, I don't know if it would go anywhere or if anyone would listen to it.
Before we go into that reading, we noticed that today, actually, a lot of people are trending the hashtag boycott Hamilton.
That's right. By the time we drop this episode, it'll have been a few days since the boycott Hamilton hashtag had been started, but it's worth talking about this huge piece of really Hamilton-related news because the vice president-elect of our country, the United States of America, Mike Pence, went to see Hamilton live in New York City, and the audience did not give him a very happy reception.
No, but the cast, particularly Brandon Victor Dixon, who read this statement directed to Mr. Pence, was actually very polite. And the statement itself, I thought, was very polite as well.
Right. He's our brand new Aaron Burr on Broadway. He's the one who is supposed to talk less, smile more, and yet in this statement, he did smile while he was speaking very respectfully to Vice President-elect Pence, but he wasn't necessarily silent about where he stood. He went ahead and silenced the boos from the audience. He said, hey, there's nothing to boo here. We want to be respectful. And then he started to read this statement. And the statement itself, I think, is worth discussing a little bit.
Yeah, this prepared statement has caused a bit of controversy, and it even brought a reply from President-elect Trump himself, and a lot of back and forth between Trump supporters and his detractors.
That's right. This particular interaction has been hot and kind of a little bit toxic at times. Donald Trump, wherever you stand on supporting him, giving him a chance, or actively shutting down a lot of his stances, wherever you fall on the political spectrum, we're not making a stand as Graphomania Podcast Network about our political positions, although you've probably been able to put together where Vinton and I stand on certain issues. Wherever you stand on this, it's interesting to look at how this is all playing out. And I think, for our part, if you do happen to be participating in the boycott of Hamilton, an American musical, feel free to send us your tickets to the musical, and we'll keep them safe so that no one can use them. I mean,
Yes, please, thank you.
We will keep those tickets safe for you if you happen to have a ticket and don't want to use it. If you haven't already seen the video of Brandon and the rest of the cast standing on the stage reading this prepared statement from the cast to Vice President-elect Mike Pence, we will put a link to the recording in the show notes. There are multiple recordings because they actually encouraged people to get their phones out of their pockets and record them doing it. So there are recordings from the balcony, recordings from the front rows. There's an official recording that Hamilton the Musical on Twitter retweeted and put out there. So there are a lot of recordings of this.
Which I think was a good thing to do. I don't think it was for just putting it out there and showing, hey, look at this thing we did, but also just so no one could say that they said anything that they didn't say.
Right.
We have a recording of exactly what was said.
And what was said, you can obviously listen to the video, but these are the words. Vice President-elect Pence, we welcome you and we truly thank you for joining us at Hamilton, an American musical. We really do. We, sir, are the diverse America who are alarmed and anxious that your new administration will not protect us, our planet, our children, our parents, or defend us and uphold our inalienable rights, sir. But we truly hope that this show has inspired you to uphold our American values and work on behalf of all of us, all of us. We truly thank you for sharing this show, this wonderful American story told by a diverse group of men, women of different colors, creeds, and orientations. End quote. And so that has taken off on social media. People saying the Hamilton cast shouldn't have gotten political about this, or that the people in the audience shouldn't have been booing the president. And then there's been a lot of misinformation out there about the cast actually being the disrespectful people booing, when that's clearly not what happened. But we have a setting in this particular context where Hamilton is now front and center of American politics in a really strange twisting of events.
And it will be interesting in the coming days to see what after effects of this might be.
That's right. We don't know yet how this will affect the legacy of Hamilton, an American musical, but it is going to be very interesting to go into an administration, from one administration where the Obamas are praising this musical left and right, to another administration where Donald Trump has actively said that the cast of Hamilton was very rude last night to a good man, Mike Pence, and that Mike Pence was harassed at the theater by the cast of Hamilton. So very different opinions of this musical by our two presidents that are the current president and the upcoming president. Going to be interesting to see how this comes to play. But from one controversial statement to another, let's leave behind the current news and travel backwards in time to this controversial statement known as the Reynolds Pamphlet by Alexander Hamilton.
We present to you the Reynolds Pamphlet, Part 2.
Reynolds, as will be seen by Exhibit 2A, alleges that a merchant came to him and offered as a volunteer to be his bail, who he suspected had been instigated to it by me, and after being decoyed to the place the merchant wished to carry him to, he refused being his bail, unless he would deposit a sum of money to some considerable amount, which he could not do, and was in consequence committed to prison. Klingman, Exhibit 4A, tells the same story in substance, though with some differences in form, leaving to be implied what Reynolds expresses and naming Henry Seckle as the merchant. The deposition of this respectable citizen, Exhibit 13, gives the lie to both, and shows that he was in fact the agent of Klingman, from motives of goodwill to him, and as former bookkeeper, that he never had any communication with me concerning either of them till after they were both in custody, that when he came as a messenger to me from one of them, I not only declined interposing in their behalf, but informed Mr. Seckle that they had been guilty of a crime and advised him to have nothing to do with them. This single fact goes far to invalidate the whole story. It shews plainly the disregard of truth and the malice by which the parties were actuated. Other important inferences are to be drawn from the transaction. Had I been conscious that I had anything to fear from Reynolds of the nature which had been pretended, should I have warned Mr. Seckle against having anything to do with them? Should I not rather have encouraged him to have come to their assistance? Should I not have been eager to promote their liberation? But this is not the only instance in which I acted to a contrary part. Klingman testifies in Exhibit 5 that I would not permit Francis, a clerk in my office, to become their bail, but signified to him that if he did it, he must quit the department. Klingman states in Exhibit 4A that my note in answer to Reynolds' application for a loan towards a subscription to the Lancaster Turnpike was in his possession from about the time it was written, June 1792. This circumstance, apparently trivial, is very explanatory. To what end had Klingman the custody of this note all the time if it was not part of a project to lay the foundation for some false accusation?
It appears from Exhibit 5 that Francis had said, or was stated to have said, something to my prejudice. If my memory serves me right, it was that he had been my agent in some speculations. When Francis was interrogated concerning it, he absolutely denied that he had said anything of the kind. The charge which this same Francis afterwards preferred against me to the House of Representatives, and the fate of it, have been already mentioned. It is illustrative of the nature of the combination which was formed against me. There are other features in the documents which are relied upon to constitute the charge against me, that are of a nature to corroborate the inference to be drawn from the particulars which have been noticed. But there is no need to be over minute. I am much mistaken if the view which has been taken of the subject is not sufficient, without anything further, to establish my innocence with every discerning and fair mind. I proceed, in the next place, to offer a frank and plain solution of the enigma, by giving a history of the origin and progress of my connection with Mrs. Reynolds, of its discovery, real and pretended by the husband, and of the disagreeable embarrassments to which it exposed me. This history will be supported by the letters of Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, which leave no room for doubt of the principal facts, and at the same time explain with precision the objects of the little notes from me which have been published, showing clearly that such of them as have related to money had no reference to any concern in speculation. As the situation which will be disclosed will fully explain every ambiguous appearance and meet satisfactory the written documents, nothing more can be requisite to my justification. For frail indeed will be the tenure by which the most blameless man will hold his reputation, if the assertions of 3 of the most abandoned characters in the community, 2 of them stigmatized by the discrediting crime which has been mentioned, are sufficient to blast it. The business of accusation would soon become in such a case a regular trade, and men's reputations would be bought and sold like any marketable commodity.
Sometime in the summer of the year 1791, a woman called at my house in the city of Philadelphia and asked to speak with me in private. I attended her into a room apart from the family. With a seeming air of affliction, she informed me that she was a daughter of a Mr. Lewis, sister to a Mr. G. Livingston of the state of New York, and wife to a Mr. Reynolds, whose father was in the commissary department during the war with Great Britain, that her husband, who for a long time had treated her very cruelly, had lately left her to live with another woman, and in so destitute a condition that though desirous of returning to her friends, she had not a means, that knowing I was a citizen of New York, she had taken the liberty to apply to my humanity for assistance. I replied that her situation was a very interesting one, that I was disposed to afford her assistance, to convey her to her friends, but this at the moment not being convenient to me, which was the fact, I must request the place of her residence, to which I should bring or send a small supply of money. She told me the street and the number of the house where she lodged. In the evening, I put a bank bill in my pocket and went to the house. I inquired for Mrs. Reynolds and was shown upstairs, at the head of which she met me and conducted me into a bedroom. I took the bill out of my pocket and gave it to her. Some conversation ensued, from which it was quickly apparent that other than pecuniary consolation would be acceptable. After this, I had frequent meetings with her, most of them at my own house, Mrs. Hamilton, with her children, being absent on a visit to her father. In the course of a short time, she mentioned to me that her husband had solicited a reconciliation and affected to consult me about it. I advised to it, and was soon after informed by her that it had taken place. She told me besides that her husband had been engaged in speculation, and she believed could give information respecting the conduct of some persons in the department which would be useful. I sent for Reynolds, who came to me accordingly.
In the course of our interview, he confessed that he had obtained a list of claims from a person in my department, which he had made use in his speculations. I invited him, by the expectation of my friendship and good offices, to disclose the person. After some affection of scruple, he pretended to yield, and ascribed the infidelity to Mr. Dewar, from whom he said he had obtained the list in New York, while he, Dewar, was in the department. As Mr. Dewar had resigned his office some time before the seat of government was removed to Philadelphia, this discovery if it had been true, was not very important. Yet it was the interest of my passions to appear to set value upon it, and to continue the expectation of friendship and good offices. Mr. Reynolds told me he was going to Virginia, and on his return would point out something in which I could serve him. I do not know, but he said something about employment in a public office. On his return, he asked employment as a clerk in the Treasury Department. The knowledge I had acquired of him was decisive against such a request. I parried it by telling him what was true, that there was no vacancy in my immediate office, and that the appointment of clerks in the other branches of the department was left to the chiefs of their respective branches. Reynolds alleged, as Klingman relates in Exhibit 4a, as a topic of complaint against me, that I had promised him employment and had disappointed him. The situation with the wife would naturally incline me to conciliate this man. It is possible I may have used vague expressions which raised expectation, but the more I learned of the person, the more inadmissible his employment in a public office became. Some material reflections will occur here to a discerning mind. Could I have preferred my private gratification to the public interest? Should I not have found the employment he desired for a man whom it was so convenient to me on my own statement to lay under obligations? Had I any such connection with him as he has since pretended, is it likely that he would have wanted other employment? Or is it likely that, wanting it, I should have hazarded his resentment by a persevering refusal? This little circumstance shows at once the delicacy of my conduct and its public relations, and the impossibility of my having had the connection pretended with Reynolds.
The intercourse with Mrs. Reynolds in the meantime continued, and through various reflections, in which a further knowledge of Reynolds' character and the suspicion of some concert between the husband and wife bore a part, induced me to wish a cessation to it. Yet her conduct made it extremely difficult to disentangle myself. All the appearances of violent attachment and of agonizing distress at the idea of relinquishment were played off with a most imposing art. This, though it did not make me entirely the dupe of the plot, yet kept me in a state of irresolution. My sensibility, perhaps my vanity, admitted the possibility of a real fondness, and led me to adopt the plan of a gradual discontinuance rather than a sudden interruption, as least calculated to give pain, if a real partiality existed. Mrs. Reynolds, on the other hand, employed every effort to keep up my attention and visits. Her pen was freely employed, and her letters were filled with those tender and pathetic effusions which would have been natural to a woman truly fond and neglected. One day I received a letter from her, which is in the appendix Exhibit 1b, intimating a discovery by her husband. It was matter of doubt with me whether there had been really a discovery by accident, or whether the time for the catastrophe of the plot was arrived. The same day, being the 15th of December, 1791, I received from Mr. Reynolds the letter, Exhibit 2b, by which he informs me of the detection of his wife in the act of writing a letter to me, and that he had obtained from her a discovery of her connection with me, suggesting that it was the consequence of an undue advantage taken of her distress.
In answer to this, I sent him a note or message desiring him to call upon me at my office, which I think he did the same day. He, in substance, repeated the topics contained in his letter, and concluded, as he had done there, that he was resolved to have satisfaction. I replied that he knew best what evidence he had of the alleged connection between me and his wife, that I neither admitted nor denied it, that if he knew of any injury I had done to him, entitling him to satisfaction, it lay with him to name it. He traveled over the same ground as before, and again concluded with the same vague claim of satisfaction, but without specifying the kind which would content him. It was easy to understand that he wanted money, and to prevent an explosion. I resolved to gratify him. But, willing to manage his delicacy, if he had any, I reminded him that I had at our first interview made him a promise of service, that I was disposed to do it as far as might be proper and in my power, and requested him to consider in what manner I could do it, and to write to me. He withdrew with a promise of compliance. 2 days after, the 17th of December, he wrote me a letter, Exhibit 3B. The evident drift of this letter is to exaggerate the injury done by me, to make a display of sensibility, and to magnify the atonement, which was to be required. It, however, comes to no conclusion, but proposes a meeting at the George Tavern, or at some other place more agreeable to me, which I should name. On receipt of this letter, I called upon Reynolds, and assuming a decisive tone, told him that I was tired of his indecision, and insisted upon his declaring to me explicitly what it was he aimed at. He again promised to explain by letter.
On the 19th, I received the promised letter, Exhibit 4B, the essence of which is that he was willing to take $1,000 as the plaister of his wounded honor. I determined to give it to him, and did so in 2 payments, as per receipts, Exhibit 5 and 6, dated the 22nd of December and the 3rd of January. It is a little remarkable that an avaricious, speculating Secretary of the Treasury should have been so straitened for money as to be obliged to satisfy an engagement of this sort by 2 different payments. On the 17th of January, I received the letter, Exhibit 5, by which Reynolds invites me to renew my visits to his wife. He had before requested that I would see her no more. The motive to this step appears in the conclusion of the letter. Quote, I rely upon your befriending me, if there should anything offer that should be to my advantage, as you express a wish to befriend me. End quote. Is the pre-existence of a speculating connection reconcilable with this mode of expression? If I recollect rightly, I did not immediately accept the invitation, nor till after I had received several very importunate letters from Mrs. Reynolds. See her letters Exhibit 8B, 9, 10. On the 24th of March following, I received a letter from Reynolds, Exhibit 11, and on the same day one from his wife, Exhibit 12. These letters will further illustrate the obliging cooperation of the husband with his wife to ailment and keep alive my connection with her.
The letters from Reynolds, Exhibits 13 to 16, are an additional comment upon the same plan. It was a persevering scheme to spare no pains to levy contributions upon my passions on the one hand, and upon my apprehensions of discovery on the other. It was probably to Exhibit 14 that my note in these words was an answer. Quote, tomorrow what is requested will be done. 'Twill hardly be possible today. Unquote. The letter presses for the loan which is asked for today. A scarcity of cash, which was not very uncommon, is believed to have modeled the reply. The letter Exhibit 17 is a masterpiece. The husband there forbids my future visits to his wife, chiefly because I was careful to avoid publicity. It was probably necessary to the project of some deeper treason against me that I should be seen at the house. Hence was it contrived, with all the caution on my part to avoid it, that Clingman should occasionally see me. The interdiction was every way welcome, and was, I believe, strictly observed. On the 2nd of June following, I received the letter Exhibit 18 from Mrs. Reynolds, which proves it was not her plan yet to let me off. It was probably the prelude to the letter from Reynolds, Exhibit 19, soliciting a loan of $300 towards a subscription to the Lancaster Turnpike. Clingman's statement, Exhibit 4A, admits on the information of Reynolds that to this letter the following note from me was an answer. Quote, it is utterly out of my power, I assure you, upon my honor, to comply with your request. Your note is returned. Unquote. The letter itself demonstrates that there was no concern in speculation on my part. that the money is asked for as a favor and as a loan, to be reimbursed simply and without profit in less than a fortnight. My answer shows that even the loan was refused.
The letter Exhibit 20 from Reynolds explains the object of my note in these words, quote, "Enclosed are $50. They could not be sent sooner," end quote, proving that this sum also was begged for in a very apologetic style as a mere loan. The letters of the 24th and 30th of August, Exhibits 21 and 22, furnish the key to the affair of the $200 mentioned by Klingman in Exhibit 4, showing that this sum likewise was asked by way of loan towards furnishing a small boarding house which Reynolds and his wife were or pretended to be about to set up. These letters collectively furnish a complete elucidation of the nature of my transactions with Reynolds. They resolve them into an amorous connection with his wife, detected or pretended to be detected by the husband, imposing on me the necessity of a pecuniary composition with him, and leaving me afterwards under a duress for fear of disclosure, which was the instrument of levying upon me from time to time forced loans. They apply directly to this state of things. The notes, which Reynolds was so careful to preserve, and which had been employed to excite suspicion. 4, and the principle of these notes have been not only generally, but particularly explained, I shall briefly notice the remaining 2. Quote, "My dear sir, I expected to have heard the day after I had the pleasure of seeing you," end quote. This fragment, if truly part of a letter to Reynolds, denotes nothing more than a disposition to be civil to a man whom, as I said before, it was the interest of my passions to conciliate. But I verily believe it was not part of a letter to him, because I do not believe that I ever addressed him in such a style. It may very well have been part of a letter to some other person, procured by means of which I am ignorant, or it may have been the beginning of an intended letter, torn off, thrown into the chimney in my office, which was a common practice, and there or after it had been swept out, picked up by Reynolds or some coadjutor of his. There appears to have been more than one clerk in the department somehow connected with him.
The endeavor shown by the letter, Exhibit 17, to induce me to render my visits to Mrs. Reynolds more public, and the great care with which my little notes were preserved, justified the belief that at a period before it was attempted, the idea of implicating me in some accusation with a view to the advantage of the accusers was entertained. Hence the motive to pick up and persevere any fragment which might favor the idea of friendly or confidential correspondence. Secondly, quote, "The person Mr. Reynolds inquired for on Friday waited for him all the evening at his house from a little after 7. Mr. R. may see him at any time today or tomorrow between the hours of 2 and 3, unquote. Mrs. Reynolds more than once communicated to me that Reynolds would occasionally relapse into discontent to his situation, would treat her very ill, hint at the assassination of me, and more openly threaten, by way of revenge, to inform Mrs. Hamilton. All this naturally gave some uneasiness. I could not be absolutely certain whether it was artifice or reality. In the workings of human inconsistency, it was very possible that the same man might be corrupt enough to compound for his wife's chastity, and yet have sensibility enough to be restless in a situation and to hate the cause of it. Reflections like these induced me for some time to use palliatives with the ill humors which were announced to me. Reynolds had called upon me in one of these discontented moods, real or pretended. I was unwilling to provoke him by the appearance of neglect, and having failed to be at home at the hour he had been permitted to call, I wrote her the above note to obviate an ill impression.
The foregoing narrative and the remarks accompanying it have prepared the way for a perusal of the letters themselves. The more attention is used in this, the more entire will be the satisfaction which they will afford. It has been seen that an explanation on the subject was had contemporarily, that is in December 1792, with 3 members of Congress, F. A. Muhlenberg, J. Monroe, and A. Venable. It is proper that the circumstances of this transaction should be accurately understood. The manner in which Mr. Muhlenberg became engaged in the affair is fully set forth in the document Exhibit 1A. It is not equally clear how the 2 other gentlemen came to embark in it. The phraseology in reference to this point in the close of Exhibit 1A and beginning of Exhibit 2A is rather equivocal. The gentlemen, if they please, can explain it. But on the morning of the 15th of December, 1792, the above-mentioned gentlemen presented themselves at my office. Mr. Muhlenberg was then speaker. He introduced the subject by observing to me that they had observed a very improper connection between me and a Mr. Reynolds. Extremely hurt by this mode of introduction, I arrested the progress of the discourse by giving way to very strong expressions of indignation. The gentleman explained, telling me in substance that I had misapprehended them, that they did not intend to take the fact for established, that their meaning was to apprise me that unsought by them information had been given them of an improper pecuniary connection between Mr. Reynolds and myself, that they had thought it their duty to pursue it, and had become possessed of some documents of a suspicious complexion, that they had contemplated the laying the matter before the President, but before they did this, they thought it right to apprise me of the affair and to afford an opportunity of explanation, declaring at the same time that their agency in the matter was influenced solely by a sense of public duty and by no motive of personal ill will. If my memory be correct, the notes from me in a disguised hand were now shewn to me, which, without a moment's hesitation, I acknowledged to be mine.
I replied that the affair was now put upon a different footing, that I always stood ready to meet fair inquiry with frank communication, that it happened in the present instance to be in my power by written documents to remove all doubt as to the real nature of the business and fully to convince that nothing of the kind imputed to me did in fact exist. The same evening at my house was by mutual consent a point for an explanation. I immediately after saw Mr. Walcott and for the first time informed him of the affair and of the interview just had, and delivering into his hands for perusal the documents of which I was possessed, I engaged him to be present at the intended explanation in the evening. In the evening, the proposed meeting took place, and Mr. Walcott, according to my request, attended. The information, which had been received to that time from Clingman, Reynolds, and his wife, was communicated to me, and the notes were, I think, again exhibited. I started an explanation. The circumstances of my affair with Mrs. Reynolds and the consequences of it, and in confirmation produced the documents, Exhibits 1B to 22. One or more of the gentlemen, Mr. Walcott's certificate, Exhibit 24, mentions one, Mr. Venable, but I think the same may be said of Mr. Muhlenberg, was struck with so much conviction before I had gotten through the communication that they delicately urged me to discontinue it as unnecessary. I insisted upon going through the whole and did so. The result was a full and unequivocal acknowledgment on the part of the 3 gentlemen of perfect satisfaction with the explanation and expressions of regret at the trouble and embarrassment which had been occasioned to me. Mr. Muhlenberg and Mr. Venable, in particular, manifested a degree of sensibility on the occasion. Mr. Monroe was more cold, but entirely explicit.
One of the gentlemen, I think, expressed a hope that I was also satisfied with their conduct in conducting the inquiry. I answered that they knew I had been hurt at the opening of the affair, that this accepted, I was satisfied with their conduct, and considered myself as having been treated with candor or with fairness and liberality. I do not now pretend to recollect the exact terms. I took the next morning a memorandum of the substance of what was said to me, which will be seen by a copy of it transmitted in a letter to each of the gentlemen, Exhibit 25. I deny absolutely, as alleged by the editor of the publication in question, that I entreated a suspension of the communication to the President, or that from the beginning to the end of the inquiry I asked any favor or indulgence whatever, and that I discovered any symptom different from that of a proud consciousness of innocence. Some days after the explanation, I wrote to the three gentlemen the letter Exhibit 26, already published. That letter evinces the light in which I considered myself as standing in their view. I received from Mr. Muhlenberg and Mr. Monroe in answer the letters Exhibit 27 and 28. Thus the affair remained till the pamphlets Exhibit 5 and 6 of the History of the United States for 1796 appeared, with the exception of some dark whispers which were communicated to me by a friend in Virginia, and to which I replied by a statement of what had passed. When I saw Exhibit 5, though it was evidence of a base infidelity somewhere, yet firmly believing that nothing more than a want of due care was chargeable upon either of the three gentlemen who had made the inquiry, I immediately wrote to each of them a letter, of which Exhibit 25 is a copy, in full confidence that their answer would put the whole business at rest. I ventured to believe, from the appearances on their part at closing our former interview on the subject, that their answers would have been both cordial and explicit. I acknowledge that I was astonished when I came to read in the pamphlet Exhibit 6, the conclusion of the document Exhibit 5 contained the equivocal phrase, quote, "We left him under an impression our suspicions were removed," end quote, which seemed to imply that this had been a mere piece of management, and that the impression given me had not been reciprocal. The appearance of duplicity incensed me, but resolving to proceed with caution and moderation, I thought the first proper step was to inquire of the gentleman whether the paper was genuine. A letter was written for this purpose, the copy of which I have mislaid. I afterwards received from Messrs. Muhlenberg and Venable the letters Exhibit 29, 30, and 31.
Receiving no answer from Mr. Monroe, and hearing of his arrival at New York, I called upon him. The issue of the interview was that an answer was to be given by him, in conjunction with Mr. Muhlenberg and Mr. Venerable, on his return to Philadelphia. He, thinking that as the agency had been joint, it was most proper the answer should be joint, and informing me that Mr. Venerable had told him he would wait his return. I came to Philadelphia accordingly to bring the affair to a close, but on my arrival I found Mr. Venerable had left the city for Virginia. Mr. Monroe reached Philadelphia according to his appointment, and the morning following wrote me the note Exhibit 32. While this note was on its way to my lodgings, I was on my way to his. I had a conversation with him, from which we separated with a repetition of the assurance in the note. In the course of the interviews with Mr. Monroe, the equivoque in document Exhibit 5A and the paper of January 2nd, 1793, under his signature, were noticed. I received the day following the letter Exhibit 33, to which I returned the answer Exhibit 34, accompanied by the letter Exhibit 35, which was succeeded by the letters Exhibit 36, 37, 38, 39, and 40. In due time, the sequel of the correspondence will appear. Though extremely disagreeable to me, for very obvious reasons, I at length determined, in order that no cloud whatever might be left on the affair, to publish the documents which had been communicated to Messrs. Monroe, Muhlenberg, and Venable, all which will be seen in the appendix from Exhibit 1B to Exhibits 22 inclusively. The information from Clingman of the 2nd January 1793, to which the signature of Mr. Monroe is annexed, seems to require an observation or two in addition to what is contained in my letter to him, Exhibit 39. Klingman first suggests that he had been apprised of my vindication through Mr. Wolcott a day or two after it had been communicated. It did not occur to me to inquire of Mr. Wolcott on this point, and he being now absent from Philadelphia, I cannot do it at this moment, though I can have no doubt of the friendly intention of Mr. Wolcott, if the suggestion of Klingman in this particular be taken as true. Yet from the condition of secrecy which was annexed to my communication, there is the strongest reason to conclude it is not true. If not true, there is besides but one of two solutions. Either that he obtained the information from one of the three gentlemen who made the inquiry, which would have been a very dishonorable act in the party, or that he conjectured what my defense was from what he before knew it truly could be. For there is the highest probability that through Reynolds and his wife, and as an accomplice, he was privy to the whole affair. This last method of accounting for his knowledge would be conclusive on the sincerity and genuineness of the defense.
But the turn which Klingman gives to the matter must necessarily fall to the ground. It is that Mrs. Reynolds denied her amorous connection with me and represented the suggestion of it as a mere contrivance between her husband and myself to cover me, alleging that there had been a fabrication of letters and receipts to countenance it. The plain answer is that Mrs. Reynolds' own letters contradict absolutely this artful explanation of hers, if indeed she ever made it, of which Klingman's assertion is no evidence whatsoever. These letters are proved by the affidavit Exhibit 51, though it will easily be conceived that the proof of them was rendered no easy matter by a lapse of near 5 years. They shew explicitly the connection with her, the discovery of it by her husband, and the pains she took to prolong it when I evidently wished to get rid of it. This cuts up by the root the pretense of a contrivance between the husband and myself to fabricate the evidences of it. The variety of shapes which this woman would assume was endless. In a conversation between her and a gentleman whom I am not at liberty publicly to name, she made a voluntary confession of her belief, and even knowledge that I was innocent of all that had been laid to my charge by Reynolds, or any other person of her acquaintance, spoke of me in exalted terms of esteem and respect, declared in the most solemn manner her extreme unhappiness lest I should suppose her accessory to the trouble which had been given me on that account, and expressed her fear that the resentment of Mr. Reynolds on a particular score might have urged him improper lengths of revenge, appearing at the same time extremely agitated and unhappy. With the gentleman who gives this information, I have never been in any relation personal or political that could be supposed to bias him. His name would evince that he is an impartial witness. And though I am not permitted to make a public use of it, I am permitted to refer any gentleman to the perusal of his letter in the hands of William Bingham, Esquire, who is also so obliged as to permit me to deposit with him for similar inspection all the original papers which are contained in the appendix of this narrative. The letter from the gentleman above alluded to has been already shown to Mr. Monroe.
Let me now, in the last place, recur to some comments in which the hireling editors of the pamphlets, Exhibits 5 and 6, has thought fit to indulge himself. The first of them is that the soft language of one of my notes addressed to a man in the habit of threatening me with disgrace is incompatible with the idea of innocence. The threats alluded to must be those of being able to hang the Secretary of Treasury. How does it appear that Reynolds was in such a habit? No otherwise than by the declaration of Reynolds and Klingman. If the assertions of these men are to condemn me, there is an end of the question. There is no need by elaborate deductions from parts of their assertions to endeavor to establish what their assertions collectively affirm in express terms. If they are worthy of credit, I am guilty. If they are not, all wire-drawn inferences from parts of their story are mere artifice and nonsense, but no man, not as debauched as themselves, will believe them, independent of the positive disproof of their story in the written documents. As to the affair of threats, except those in Reynolds' letters respecting the connection with his wife, which it will be perceived were very gentle for the occasion, not the least idea of the sort ever reached me till after the imprisonment of Reynolds. Mr. Walcott's certificate shows my conduct in that case, notwithstanding the powerful motives I may be presumed to have had to desire the liberation of Reynolds on account of my situation with his wife. I cautioned Mr. Walcott not to facilitate his liberation, till the affair of the threat was satisfactorily cleared up. The solemn denial of it in Mr. Reynolds' letter, Exhibit 52, was considered by Mr. Walcott as sufficient. This is further proof that though in respect to my situation with his wife, I was somewhat in Reynolds' power, I was not disposed to make any improper concession to the apprehension of this assessment. As the threats intimated in his letters, the nature of the cause will show that the soft tone of my note was not only compatible with them, but a natural consequence of them. But it is observed that the dread of the disclosure of an amorous connection was not a sufficient cause for my humility, and that I had nothing to lose as to my reputation for chastity, concerning which the world had fixed a previous opinion.
I shall not enter into the question what was the previous opinion entertained of me in this particular, nor how well founded, if it was indeed such as it is represented to have been. It is sufficient to say that there is a wide difference between vague rumors and suspicions and the evidence of a positive fact. No man not indelicately unprincipled with the state of manners in his country would be willing to have a conjugal infidelity fixed upon him with positive certainty. He would know that it would justly injure him with a considerable and respectable portion of society, and especially no man tender of the happiness of an excellent wife could without extreme pain look forward to the affliction which she might endure from the disclosure, especially a public disclosure of the fact. Those best acquainted with the interior of my domestic life will best appreciate the force of such a consideration upon me. The truth was that in both relations, and especially the last, I dreaded extremely a disclosure, and was willing to make large sacrifices to avoid it. It is true that from the acquiescence of Reynolds I had strong ties upon his secrecy, but how could I rely upon any tie upon so base a character? How could I know but that from moment to moment he might, at the expense of his own disgrace, become the mercenary of a party with whom to blast my character in any way is a favorite object? Strong inferences are attempted to be drawn from the release of Clingman and Reynolds with the consent of the Treasury, from the want of communicativeness of Reynolds while in prison, from the subsequent disappearance of Reynolds and his wife, and from their not having been produced by me in order to be confronted at the time of the explanation.
As to the first, it was emphatically the transaction of Mr. Walcott, the then Comptroller of the Treasury, and was bottomed upon a very adequate motive, and one as appears from the document Exhibit 1A, early contemplated in this light by that officer. It was certainly of more consequence to the public to detect and expel from the bosom of the Treasury Department an unfaithful clerk to prevent future and extensive mischief than to disgrace and punish two worthless individuals. Besides that, a powerful influence foreign to me was exerted to procure indulgence to them. That of Mr. Muhlenberg and Colonel Burr, that of Colonel Wadsworth, which, though insidiously placed to my account, was, to the best of my recollection, utterly unknown to me at the time, and according to the confession of Mrs. Reynolds herself, was put in motion by her entreaty. Candid men will derive strong evidence of my innocence and my delicacy from the reflection that under circumstances so peculiar, the culprits were compelled to give a real and substantial equivalent for the relief which they obtained from a department over which I presided. The backwardness of Reynolds to enter into detail while in jail was an argument of nothing but the conscience of his inability to communicate any particulars which could be supported. He found it more convenient to deal in generals and to keep up appearances by giving promises for the future. As to the disappearance of the parties after the liberation, how am I answerable for it? Is it not presumable that the instance discovered at the Treasury was not the only offense of its kind of which they were guilty? After one detection, is it not very probable that Reynolds fled to avoid detection in other cases? But exclusive of this, it is known and might easily be proved that Reynolds was considerably in debt. What more natural for him than to fly from his creditors after having been once exposed by confinement for such a crime? Moreover, atrocious as his conduct had been toward me, was it not natural for him to fear that my resentment might be excited at the discovery of it, and that it might have been deemed a sufficient reasoning for retracting the indulgence which was shown by withdrawing the prosecution, and for recommending it? One or all of these considerations will explain the disappearances of Reynolds without imputing it to me as a method of getting rid of a dangerous witness.
That disappearance rendered it impracticable if it had been desired to bring him forward to be confronted. As to Clingman, it was not pretended that he knew anything of what was charged upon me, otherwise than by the notes which he produced, and the information of Reynolds and his wife. As to Mrs. Reynolds, she in fact appears by Clingman's last story to have remained and to have been accessible through him by the gentleman who had undertaken the inquiry. If they supposed it necessary to the elucidation of the affair, why did not they bring her forward? There can be no doubt of the sufficiency of Clingman's influence for this purpose, when it is understood that Mrs. Reynolds and he afterwards lived together as man and wife. But to what purpose the confronting? What would it have availed the elucidation of truth if Reynolds and his wife had impudently made allegations which I denied? Relative character and the written documents must still determine. These could decide without it, and they were relied upon. But could it be expected that I should so debase myself as to think it necessary to my vindication to be confronted with a person such as Reynolds? Could I have borne to suffer my veracity to be exposed to the humiliating competition? For what? Why, it is said, to tear up the last twig of jealousy. But when I knew that I possessed written documents which were decisive, how could I foresee that any twig of jealousy would remain, when the proofs I did produce to the gentlemen were admitted by them to be completely satisfactory, and by some of them to be more than sufficient? How could I dream of the expediency of producing more? How could I imagine that every twig of jealousy was not plucked up? If after the recent confessions of the gentlemen themselves, it could be useful to fortify the proof of the full conviction my explanation had wrought, I might appeal to the total silence concerning this charge, when at a subsequent period in the year 1793, there was such an active legislative persecution of me. It might not even perhaps be difficult to establish that it came under the eye of Mr. Giles, and that he discarded it as the plain case of a private amour unconnected with anything that was the proper subject of a public attack.
Thus has my desire to destroy this slander completely led me to a more copious and particular examination of it than I am sure was necessary. The bare perusal of the letters from Reynolds and his wife is sufficient to convince my greatest enemy that there is nothing worse in the affair than an irregular and indelicate amour. For this I bow to the just censure which it merits. I have paid pretty severely for the folly and can never recollect it without disgust and self-condemnation. It might seem affectation to say more. To unfold more clearly the malicious intent by which the present revival of the affair must have been influenced, I shall annex an affidavit of Mr. Webster, tending to confirm my declaration of the utter falsehood of the assertion that a menace of publishing the papers which have been published had arrested the progress of an attempt to hold me up as a candidate for the office of president. Does this editor imagine that he will escape the just odium which waits him by the miserable subterfuge of saying that he had the information from a respectable citizen of New York? Till he names the author, the inevitable inference must be that he has fabricated the tale.
Signed, Alexander Hamilton, Philadelphia, July 1797.
All right, that'll do it for this week.
Man, that was hard to read.
It was a lot.
There's so many words. It was difficult. There were a lot of times that we just deleted our outtakes and had to go backwards to re-record certain things because those words are old and hard. And some of his sentences sounded weird. He always used the word shoon instead of shown, and strange things happened. Man, the guy had run-on sentences left and right.
Yeah, there was a lot of those.
It was just so long-winded. I probably wouldn't have given this a really high grade if I were grading it in an English class.
But that's because we live so much later and language has changed.
Exactly. So in the language of his contemporaries, this was a hot pamphlet that was circulated, not just by Hamilton, but mostly by his enemies who wanted to remind everybody that he had been invested in this amour, this affair that was quite improper for a man of his station, or really any married man whatsoever.
And again, I'd like to remind you that if you'd like more information on the Reynolds Pamphlet and our commentary on that, we do have an episode where we talked about that song and went into the history around the Reynolds Pamphlet.
You can find that episode and every other episode from every podcast that is produced by Graphomania Podcast Network at graphocast.com.
If you'd like to get into contact with us, you can email us, contact@graphocast.com, hit us up on Twitter, @graphocast, or personally, I'm @FleshEater.
And I'm @Alpha Knight.
Until next week, we have the privilege of being your obedient servants. V.Bayne.
R.Hurlocker.
This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, graphocast.com. Follow us on Twitter @graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.